The war in the Middle East is no longer just about missiles. It is no longer just about territory or retaliation, because in the middle of this conflict, a new kind of weapon has appeared. Not a missile, not a drone, but something far more powerful. A condition, right now the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow passage through which nearly 1/5 of the world's oil flows, is no longer operating normally. Ships are waiting, routes are restricted, insurance costs are rising, and global markets are reacting in real time. But what is happening here is not just a disruption, it is control. Because Iran is not just blocking the strait, it is deciding who gets to pass, and more importantly, under what terms. In recent statements coming from Iranian officials, a clear message is beginning to form. If oil is to flow freely, again the rules may change, and the currency may change. Iranian policymakers have repeatedly emphasized the need to move away from dependence on the US dollar, especially under sanctions and financial pressure. Now for the first time that idea is being connected directly to control over one of the most important oil routes in the world. Pause for a moment because this changes everything. This is no longer just about access to oil. It is about control over how that oil is traded. Iran is not just influencing supply, it is attempting to influence the system itself, and that system has remained largely unchanged for decades. For more than half a century, global oil trade has been dominated by a single currency, the US dollar. Every major oil transaction, every global energy contract has been tied to it. This created stability, predictability, and a clear structure for global trade. But now that structure is being tested, not in economic conferences, not in policy discussions, but in the middle of a war. And this is where China enters the picture. Because China is not just watching this situation, it is deeply connected to it. China is the largest importer of oil in the world, and its economy depends on stable energy supplies. For years, Chinese officials and financial institutions have been exploring alternatives to dollar-based trade. They have promoted the use of the yuan in international transactions. They have developed payment systems outside traditional Western networks, and they have quietly expanded oil deals using their own currency. At first, these efforts were slow and limited, but over time they continued to grow. And now with the Strait of Hormuz under pressure, those efforts are becoming more relevant than ever. Because China is one of the few countries that has continued importing oil from Iran, even under sanctions and conflict. This relationship is not new, but the situation around it has changed. Now it is not just about trade, it is about leverage. Iran controls access, China provides demand, and together they create a pathway that does not depend on the dollar. This is not being announced as a formal alliance. There are no dramatic public declarations, but the direction is clear. China has consistently supported expanding the global role of its currency, and Iran has consistently pushed to reduce reliance on dollar-based systems. Now those two positions are starting to align, and the timing is not accidental, because the global energy system is already under pressure. Oil prices have surged, shipping risks have increased, supply chains are facing uncertainty. In such an environment, even a small shift can create major consequences. And this is not just about Iran and China. Other countries are watching closely, especially those whose economies depend on oil. One country in particular stands out: Saudi Arabia. For decades, Saudi Arabia has been one of the central pillars of the global oil system. Its decisions have influenced prices, shaped markets, and reinforced the role of the dollar. But in recent years, Saudi officials have signaled openness to new possibilities, including the idea of using other currencies in oil trade. This does not mean a complete shift, but it does show that the system is no longer as fixed as it once was. Because if even a small portion of oil trade moves into another currency, the impact could be significant, not immediate, but gradual. Gradual change is often the most powerful. Right now, Saudi Arabia is maintaining a careful balance, balancing its long-standing relationship with the United States, with its growing economic ties to China. And that balance is becoming harder to maintain, because the system itself is beginning to shift. And this is what makes this moment so important. We are not looking at a complete transformation, but we are witnessing the early stages of change. a change driven by conflict, by pressure, by necessity, and by opportunity, because in times of instability, new systems begin to emerge, old structures are questioned, and new alignments take shape. What is happening in the Strait of Hormuz is not just a regional crisis, it is a signal that the global oil system may not remain the same, and if that system changes, the impact will not stay limited to one region, it will spread across markets, across economies, and across the world. Because this is no longer just about oil. It is about the future of global trade. It is about the balance of economic power. And it is about a question that is now becoming impossible to ignore. What happens if oil stops being traded only in dollars? And more importantly, what happens if that change begins in the middle of a war? What is happening right now is not sudden, it is not accidental, and it is not just a reaction to war. Because behind this shift, there is a deeper strategy, a strategy that has been building quietly for years. For Iran, this moment is not just about controlling a waterway. It is about control over access, control over supply, and now control over the terms of trade. For decades, Iran has been under heavy sanctions. Its banking system restricted, its oil exports limited, and its ability to receive payments constantly challenged. The global dollar system for Iran was not just a system, it was a barrier, a system that could be used against it. So over time, Iran began looking for alternatives, ways to sell oil without depending on the dollar, ways to receive payments without relying on Western financial networks. At first, these efforts were small, indirect deals, quiet arrangements, limited partnerships, but they continued to grow. Countries like China and Russia became key partners in this process, not out of ideology, but out of shared interest, because both sides saw an opportunity to reduce dependence on a system controlled by others. Now that slow shift is becoming visible, because what Iran is doing today is not just about military positioning, it is about economic leverage. By connecting oil access to currency, Iran is changing the rules of engagement. If you want oil, you do not just negotiate safe passage, you negotiate how you will pay, and that changes the entire equation. This is where China becomes central to the story. China is not just participating in this shift, it has been preparing for it for years. China has been building financial systems outside the traditional Western structure. It has expanded trade agreements in local currencies. It has encouraged partners to accept the yuan, and it has steadily increased its use in global transactions. But there was always one major barrier: oil. Because oil remained tied to the dollar. No matter how much trade shifted, energy still flowed through the same system. Now that barrier is being tested. Because China is one of the largest buyers of Iranian oil. Even during sanctions, even during periods of tension, China continued to import oil, using alternative payment structures, often at discounted prices. Often outside the visibility of traditional systems, this created a working model. A model that did not rely on the dollar. And now under current conditions, that model is expanding. With the strait under pressure and global supply uncertain, access becomes more valuable than ever, and China is in a position to secure that access. This creates a new balance of power. Iran controls the route, China controls demand, and together they shape the terms. This is not a formal alliance. There are no official announcements declaring a new system, but the direction is clear. A parallel structure is forming, and it is growing stronger under pressure. But this shift does not stop with Iran and China, because similar patterns are already visible in other parts of the world. Russia, after facing extensive sanctions, also moved away from dollar-based trade. It began selling energy in alternative currencies. It built new financial connections, and it strengthened economic ties with countries willing to operate outside traditional systems. This creates something larger than a single partnership. It creates a network of countries that are either restricted by the current system or choosing to reduce their dependence on it. And over time, networks grow, they expand, they evolve, and they begin to compete with existing structures. This is why analysts are now watching closely, because what we are seeing is not the sudden collapse of the dollar system, it is something more gradual, more complex, the beginning of competition, System where one currency is no longer dominant alone, but shares space with others, and that creates uncertainty, because global markets depend on stability, they depend on predictability, they depend on clear rules. But a divided system creates confusion. Some oil may continue to be traded in dollars, some may shift into yuan, and that split introduces risk. Prices become harder to predict, transactions become more complicated. Financial systems become more fragile. But for some countries this is not a problem. It is an opportunity to gain more control, to reduce vulnerability, to reshape their role in the global economy. Still, this transition is not simple. Even within China, there is caution, because a global currency requires trust, it requires stability, it requires widespread acceptance, and the dollar has built that position over decades, through consistent use, through global confidence, through deep financial networks. Replacing it or even challenging it is not easy, and it will not happen overnight. But it does not need to, because even a small shift in a system this large can create significant impact, and that is exactly what is happening now. Shift has already begun, not as a dramatic collapse, but as a gradual movement, driven by pressure, driven by necessity, driven by strategy, and most importantly, driven by a world that is becoming less predictable. Because when global systems are tested, they do not remain unchanged. They adapt, they evolve, and sometimes they transform. What we are witnessing right now may not be the end of the dollar system, but it could be the beginning of a new phase, a phase where power is more distributed, where currencies compete, and where control is no longer concentrated in one place. And all of this is unfolding, not in financial institutions, not in global summits, but in the middle of a conflict that is no longer just about land or power, but about the future of the global economic system. And now the question becomes unavoidable. How will the United States respond? Because for decades the global oil system has been deeply connected to American power, not just through military presence, but through the dominance of the US dollar. The dollar has not only been a currency, it has been a foundation of global influence. Every major oil transaction strengthened that position. Every energy deal reinforced that system. And any challenge to it is not just economic, it is strategic. Right now the United States is watching these developments very closely, because what is happening is not a direct attack, but it is a shift, a slow movement that could reshape global influence over time. If oil trade begins to split between different currencies, if even a portion of global energy moves away from the dollar, the long-term impact could be significant, not immediate, but gradual. And in global systems, gradual change is often the most powerful, because it happens quietly, without a single defining moment, but with lasting consequences. The United States still holds massive advantages. Its financial system remains the largest and most trusted in the world. Its currency is deeply embedded in global trade. Its institutions are still central to international finance. But the concern is not about today, it is about direction, because once a system begins to shift, it rarely moves backward. And this is where the situation becomes more complex. Because this is not just about Iran, and it is not just about China, it is about a broader change in how countries think about power. For decades, power was measured in military strength, in economic size, in technological dominance. But now another factor is becoming more important. Control over systems, control over trade routes, control over financial networks, control over currencies. And what we are seeing right now is a combination of all of these elements. Iran is using geography, China is using economic scale, Russia is using resource leverage. And together these actions are beginning to reshape the environment. Not through direct coordination, but through aligned interests. At the same time, countries like Saudi Arabia are carefully watching, not rushing into change, but not ignoring it either. Because their position is critical. They sit at the center of the global oil system, and any shift in their policy could accelerate everything. If Saudi Arabia were to expand oil trade in other currencies even partially, it would send a powerful signal, not just to markets, but to the entire global system. For now, Saudi Arabia continues to balance maintaining its long-standing relationship with the United States while expanding its economic ties with China. And that balancing act may define the next phase of this transition, because the future may not belong to a single system, but to multiple systems operating at the same time. A world where the dollar remains dominant, but not alone, where alternative currencies grow alongside it, where countries choose based on strategy rather than tradition. And this creates a new kind of global reality, more complex, more competitive, and potentially more unstable, because multiple systems mean multiple points of tension, multiple areas of uncertainty, and fewer clear rules. Markets do not like uncertainty, investors do not like unpredictability, and global stability depends on both. Right now, the world is entering a phase where those foundations are being tested. Oil prices are reacting, trade routes are adjusting, financial strategies are shifting, and governments are reassessing their positions all at the same time. This is not a normal moment. It is a transition that is still in its early stages, but already showing its impact. And this is what makes the situation so important, because the decisions made during this period will shape what comes next. Will the dollar remain dominant without challenge? Will the yuan gain a stronger foothold in global trade? Will the world move toward a dual system, or even a fragmented one? These questions do not have immediate answers, but they are no longer theoretical. They are becoming real, and they are being shaped in real time, not in distant future, but right now, in the middle of conflict, in the middle of disruption, in the middle of change. And this is where everything connects, because what started as a regional conflict, but is now influencing global systems. What began as a disruption in one waterway is now raising questions about the future of global trade. And what seemed like a temporary crisis is now revealing deeper structural shifts. The Strait of Hormuz is no longer just a strategic location. It has become a symbol of control, a symbol of pressure, and a symbol of change. Because whoever controls the flow of energy does not just control supply, they influence the system itself, and that is what makes this moment different. This is not just another conflict, it is a turning point, a moment where the world begins to move in a new direction, slowly, gradually, but undeniably. And the most important part is that this change is not happening in isolation. It is being watched, it is being analyzed, and it is being considered by countries around the world. Because every nation now faces a decision: stay within the existing system, adapt to the emerging one, or try to balance both. And that decision will shape the future, not just of oil, not just of currencies, but of global power itself. Because in the end, this is not just about who sells oil or who buys it. It is about who sets the rules. And for the first time in decades, those rules are being questioned and possibly rewritten right in the middle of a war